In this lesson, we're going to cover some of the basic post-installation configuration steps we would perform on the new Windows Server 2012 installation. In this example, I'm going to use the local graphical interface to configure this server. And of course, we could remove that graphical interface at a later time. I'll also show you some of the command line options for some of the items, remembering that we do have the sconfig command if we have a server core installation. So my first action is to log on using the password I configured during that final phase of the installation. Server Manager will then automatically launch, and you'll notice that I actually go straight into the desktop. Whereas a Windows 8 machine, for example, goes directly into the Start menu, on a Windows Server we go straight to the desktop, and I can always pin commonly used applications to my taskbar. For example, if I find I often run Notepad, so I do the Win key plus R to bring up the Run dialog and type in Notepad, I can then right-click on the icon in the taskbar and pin this program. Now, it will just always be easily available to me. Initially, Server Manager is showing me the overall dashboard, which gives me basic information of the services and the health of this server, which currently does not have any roles or features installed other than basic file services. For my first configuration, I'm going to use local server. Now remember, by default, and you can see this here, remote management was enabled. So if I know the machine name or the IP address of this machine, I could at this point remotely manage it from a Windows 8 machine with the Windows Server 2012 Remote Server Administration tools installed, or another Windows Server 2012 box. This local server screen I see here is not available remotely though. I don't get an equivalent of this for remote boxes. So in many ways, for an initial configuration, if you are doing it manually, it is nice to use the Server Manager tool. From here, I can do all of my initial configurations. For example, I could change the name. So this is actually opening the System Control Panel applet. So if I press the Windows key plus C, that opens up the Charms bar, and I can do Settings, Control Panel. This will open the old style control panel we've used in previous versions of Windows. I can, for example, say I want to see all of the icons, and then launch the individual control panel applets, for example, System. Another way to launch this would just be Windows key plus R for the Run dialog, and just type sysdm.cpl. But the Server Manager interface is giving you a nice way to access these functions. So for example, one of the things you will likely want to do initially is change the name. So on the Computer Name tab, I click Change. I can type in my new name, and I can also, if I wish, join a domain. Type in the name of my domain, and I would then be prompted for a credential to use in joining that domain. Now, to join a machine to the domain, you do not have to be a domain administrator. You just need to have a domain account, unless your domain administrator has specifically blocked normal users from being able to join machines to the domain. Additionally, I can configure things like remote desktop, so I can enable the remote desktop protocol to actually get the full desktop directly onto this machine. Notice it is disabled by default, and notice we are also still using that System Control Panel applet. I can configure Windows updates for when I want this machine to automatically download updates, how they should be applied. And this is definitely something you should do on a new installation, download the latest updates. Now in your organization, you may be using Windows Software Update Services, you may be using System Center Configuration Manager, you may have another tool. But it's very important to keep your servers patched for protection and for taking advantage of things like performance improvements. I can change my time zone. Again, this is now opening the time and date control panel. So I can say I want to change my time zone and select what I need. I can change my IP address. So for example here, if I click on the Ethernet, I can right click and do Properties, scroll down to Internet Protocol version 4, and then if I need to, configure a static IP address if I'm not using DHCP or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. If you are using Server Core, remember that I can launch my sconfig command, and I really have the same set of actions available to me. I can configure the Windows Update settings, I can configure network settings, the date and time, computer name, domain, all of those things are still available to me. Additionally, I can use the command prompt. So for example, configuring something like the IP address, if I open up the command line, I can use the net shell command or netsh. So netsh allows me to configure the interface I wish to configure, I want to configure the IPv4, and I want to configure an address. I pass it the name of the connection. So this is the same name as I see over here in my list. So in my example, it isn't actually local area connection, it's just Ethernet. So I need to make sure that name matches. I can then say I want to use a static IP address. I can then give it what that IP address is, just making an address up here. I give it a subnet mask, and I'm done. I've now configured that address. And that would also be available if I now look in the graphical interface. So there's always a command line option. Of course, I could use PowerShell as well. Now, there are obviously typically additional configurations we have to perform for IP. For example, setting DNS servers. And again, I can use the netsh interface command and this time set the DNS server's parameters. So instead of being address, this time I could say DNS servers, and then I would put in the name of my DNS server. Maybe it's 10, and I can say it's primary. Now in this example, it's giving me an error because that doesn't actually exist. I'm just making these values up. And that would be how you would configure it from the command line. Likewise, I could also use commands to join the domain. I can also rename my computer account. And for both of these, I would use the netdom command. So netdom allows me to change the computer name and also join the domain. Another configuration you will likely want to do on your machines is obviously activate the installation. So right now I'm showing not activated. If I click this, I'll actually be able to type in a product key, which will then allow me to activate this installation. If you have a key management server in your environment, or you're using Active Directory based activation, you would enter the KMS key that is standard throughout any machine that is using KMS. So these are not specific to your organization. There is a generic key you use which tells the operating system to use KMS or ADBA. Here you can see the article that talks through these KMS keys. So there's a different key for the different versions of Windows. And all this is telling the operating system to do is talk to your KMS server or ADBA. You may also, once installation is complete, configure items such as BitLocker. Make sure the machine is being backed up. And these really help you complete the overall configuration of the machine. This concludes the initial lesson on performing post configuration steps.